What we
What
need.
we need.
What we need.
What we need.
What we need.
An idea to unite us. Today, as growing poverty, racism, and violence divide people and nations, we see the gap between the few haves and the many have-nots growing wider and wider. The prosperity and freedom of future generations and the health of people and our planet are being threatened.
The rising threat of nuclear war and natural disasters fueled by climate change are moving the doomsday clock closer to midnight. It's time to ask, what does every person need to survive and thrive as a citizen of a community, a nation, and the world?
We all need things like freedom, opportunity, power, justice.
Whether you're a working Joe or Jane struggling to pay the bills or a member of the top 1%,
A janitor or a CEO.
A teacher, farmer,
Public servant, entrepreneur,
College student.
Member of the military, stay-at-home parent.
or even a newborn baby. We all need a thriving economy that's producing goods and services. We need incomes that come from good jobs and growing businesses. But in order to grow, businesses that produce goods and services need customers with money.
So, what's missing?
in today's 21st century economy, working people must compete with lower-wage workers and labor-displacing technologies like artificial intelligence and robots, and even robots that make robots.
Jobs alone won't bring economic security to the average citizen and family.
Each of us also needs to have a share of ownership in growing businesses that use productive capital. By capital, we mean business assets like land, rentable space, equipment, computers, robots, information and energy systems, and patents.
Businesses use capital along with all types of human labor to produce the goods and services we want to buy. Capital earns profits for its owners, providing them an independent source of personal income beyond wages alone.
As you earn more and more income from your capital, you become less and less economically dependent on an employer or the government.
By spreading economic power, capital ownership also extends real political power to you, me, and we the people. Without ownership rights and responsibilities, we citizens won't have power. Without power, we won't have justice.
And without justice, we won't have freedom.
It all comes down to own or be owned. Then how do we get some capital ownership? We have to grow the economy in ways that each of us can gain a personal ownership stake without taking away wealth or property from anyone or depending on Wall Street and the past savings of the rich. So how can we do that?
By building upon Abe Lincoln's vision.
What Abe knew. In 1862, President Abraham Lincoln enacted the Homestead Act. This voluntary national economic program helped develop America's land frontier. The Homestead Act provided a free and equal opportunity for non-owners to become owners of 160 acres in the western land frontier, which eventually ran out. Sometimes, unjustly, the land and property rights of Native Americans were taken away. Also, General William Sherman's promise in 1865 of 40 acres and a mule to give the land of slave owners to free slaves was later reversed by President Andrew Johnson.
Yet, with all its problems and flaws, America's Homestead Act created many new citizen owners. It turned America into the world's most productive agricultural economy.
Along with new agricultural technologies, this freed millions from farm work to find jobs in the growing industrial frontier.
This turned America into the world's most productive industrial power. After Lincoln was assassinated, his vision of widespread citizen ownership was abandoned as America moved into the industrial age. Because of the way American industry and banks financed new capital assets, the ownership of industrial and commercial wealth became more and more concentrated in fewer and fewer hands.
Then how do we get back on track?
Today we need a more just 21st century version of the Homestead Act to help us develop the future technology frontier, a limitless frontier that has no boundaries. We need to make accessible to every person equal ownership opportunities and the means of acquiring capital. Over our entire lifetime, each of us would be able to buy and accumulate capital assets of our own. Every citizen could then earn a growing capital income, dividends, from the shares of companies we own. How do we get equal capital ownership opportunities to every citizen and family?
By
Passing the Economic Democracy
Act.
Act and getting money power and ownership to every citizen. This voluntary economic program of monetary, tax, and inheritance reforms would offer America, or any nation that adopts it, a more sustainable, free market-oriented, and just way to finance new capital being added and existing capital transferred in the economy every year. For businesses to produce more goods and services, but in a way that creates more customers with money to buy the new goods and services.
The Economic Democracy Act would stimulate more real jobs, encourage entrepreneurship and innovation, and spread prosperity and economic power. Every citizen could become an owner of productive capital. This act would build a nation of economically and politically independent citizen owners. We could all own the future, rather than be owned.
How the Economic Democracy Act works. By retooling our monetary, meaning money and credit, tax and inheritance systems to promote equal future ownership opportunities, every citizen would gain equal access to money power, every child and adult, every year of their lives. New asset-backed money and interest-free credit would be issued only for capital growth and transfers of existing private sector assets. New money would not be created for consumer spending, government spending, or Wall Street speculation. Additionally, the act would create equal capital ownership opportunities for all citizens, from the poorest to the richest. Briefly, here's how it works.
The process starts with companies selling new growth shares or transferring existing shares that pay out full dividends and provide full voting rights to their owners. These would have to be shares of profitable, well-managed companies that have customers who will buy the goods and services the new capital will produce. Through a transparent, regulated, risk-insured, and citizen-owned central banking system, each of us as citizens would have the right to receive at no cost a personal allotment each year of insured, interest-free capital credit to purchase those new shares. But where would the new money and credit come from?
In the U.S., for example, the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks would use their existing powers under Section 13, Paragraph 2 of the Federal Reserve Act. This empowers the regional Federal Reserve banks to create new money to finance agriculture, industrial, and commercial growth. Competitive local banks would judge whether a company issuing shares has a feasible capital growth project. Feasible simply means that the new capital is expected to produce enough profits to repay the loan within the expected amount of time. In response to the capital projects approved by local banks, the 12 regional feds would issue new asset-backed money for citizens to buy the new and transferred shares. The risk of bad loans would be covered by private sector capital credit insurance and reinsurance. But here's the twist. Instead of merely benefiting the existing shareholders of a growing company, capital credit would be allotted equally to every citizen through his or her own tax-sheltered capital ownership account.
Guided by their local bank or other certified financial advisor, John and Jane Q. Public, and each of their children would use their allotment of interest-free credit to invest in qualified shares. Qualified just means that these shares meet certain legal requirements, including the promise to pay out all profits as dividends and provide a vote on each share. The companies they invest in would use the money from the sale of the newly issued shares to buy new capital assets needed to grow. Each citizen's loan to buy those new shares would be paid off over 5 to 7 years, with the company's full pre-tax stream of future profits, also called future savings earned by the newly added capital assets. Once his or her capital loan is repaid, future dividends paid on those shares would become taxable income to the citizen owner when that income is taken out of his or her tax shelter capital ownership account.
Won't creating money and credit this way cause inflation?
Creating asset-backed money and interest-free credit to finance our nation's growth would not be inflationary or deflationary. This is because under the Economic Democracy Act, all new money would always be backed by real assets, and new interest-free credit would only be used for purchasing productive capital assets that could pay for themselves out of their own future stream of profits. Financing all growth with asset-backed money and equal access to future capital ownership would also reduce government deficits, as growing citizen incomes from ownership would gradually reduce the need for welfare and other income support programs.
A just tax system. Most people would agree that today's tax system is grossly complex and unfair. To encourage broad-based capital ownership, the Economic Democracy Act would introduce a more fair and simple single-rate personal income tax. Every citizen would get a living income exemption of $30,000 per adult and $20,000 per dependent. That would allow a total exemption of $100,000 for a family of four. To escape corporate income taxes, businesses would be encouraged to finance their growth by selling new voting shares and deducting all dividends paid out to the shareholders.
The Economic Democracy Act would also eliminate all payroll taxes on workers and their employers, and eliminate tax deductions, tax credits and other tax loopholes that mainly benefit the rich. All personal incomes from labor and capital, above the personal income exemption, would be taxed at a single rate. Thus, we could easily calculate the single tax rate needed to pay the costs of running government, including keeping our entitlement promises under Social Security and Medicare, maintaining a safety net for the poor, disabled and unemployed, gradually paying off our national debt, eliminating future government deficits. These new tax reforms would leave more money in the pockets of all citizens to pay for their basic needs, including food, housing, health, education, energy, transportation, communications, policing, and national security. Incomes under the poverty line could be supplemented by charity, vouchers, and tax dollars.
The Economic Democracy Act would also reform inheritance and give tax laws. The act would encourage the voluntary spreading out of monopolistic accumulations from one generation to the next. Instead of an estate being taxed, its recipients would be taxed on the value of the assets they receive above an exempted amount. For example, if the inheritance exemption was set at $1 million, every dollar received above that amount would be charged a one-time, single-rate, personal income tax, eliminating estate and gift taxes. But taxing recipients on the income they receive over the $1 million exemption would enable the wealthy person to avoid any tax on his or her estate by spreading the estate to relatives, workers, teachers, veterans, the poor, etc.
Summing it all up, the Economic Democracy Act's monetary, tax and inheritance reforms would help pay for life-enhancing technologies, green energy systems, new infrastructure and sustainable growth, while reducing entitlements and welfare costs as more citizens receive rising ownership incomes. We could create a truly free, just and democratic economic and political system, through equal opportunity and universal access to the means for every citizen to become an economically empowered owner of productive capital.
We can do all of this without forcing people to reduce their limited incomes to buy shares, which limits growth, capital investments, and jobs by reducing demand for marketable goods and services. And we wouldn't have to take away anyone's wealth or private property rights. So what do we need to do now in order to live, work, and vote together as free citizens?
We need to unite our
nation.
nation.
Make every citizen an owner.
It's time to choose. Will we own
or be owned?
For more information on the Economic Democracy Act, visit the Center for Economic and Social Justice
at cesj.org.